In this interview, I talk with my friend Joel Troyer about his 8-year-old son Landry, who's been diagnosed with autism. Joel and I met each other over 20 years ago working at a restaurant in Nashville. We've stayed in touch over the years through Facebook and other means. His story is heartwarming, heart-wrenching, and full of hope. And he's got some very interesting recent experiences that he had communicating with his son. So Joel, you and I met quite a few many years ago. It's at least 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. And at the time, neither of us were parents or married for that matter. And a lot has changed since then. And while there's many people in the world that know something about what it's like to be parents, most people don't really have any clue what it's like to be a parent when a child is facing something like autism. The challenge of being there with them in that, going through that with them and figuring out how to help them connect with their world and with you in particular. And I'd love to hear your story about what that's been like, and we'll kind of go from there.
Well, Bill, thanks first for doing this. And I think one of the first things my wife and I said when this first started for us was, how do other parents who are treating their kids not talk about this and remain so secretive? And I told my wife just before I came on this call, I said, I don't know how many people will listen to this, but maybe somebody that needs to hear it will hear it. And that's why I say yes to everything, because I don't know who's listening, and I don't know, who may hear that absolutely needs a beacon of hope, because it's a tough time. And our story started with Landry. He was born in 2013, January 8th, 2013, and he was born, he was a month early, but everything was good. He was healthy. He was, we left the hospital at a normal time, and lung function, everything was good. But, in his first year of life, Landry was sick quite often. And it's the usual, you go to the pediatrician, he's sick, and they give him Tylenol, put him on an antibiotic or a steroid treatment. And it just was this cycle in his first year of life, but he still hit all his milestones developmentally. He had, a 50-word vocabulary at 2 years old. And he was walking at 10 months. He was a happy little guy, yelling at the dog and telling the dog no, and counting to 3, and then we'd race across the yard. Just normal kid stuff at that age. And it was shortly after that Landry stopped developing new words. And then it turned into, he started losing the words that he did have. And we kept asking, is something wrong? Is something wrong? We'd ask the pediatrician. We have family members who are in the medical field, and they'd say, well, you just had a little girl, and, don't worry about it. It's fine. Well, it's never okay if your child starts going backwards developmentally. There's obviously something wrong. And we were first-time parents, and we didn't know. We just we just didn't know.
Sure.
And it was November of 2015 that the question was answered, because it was over the course of 2 days and a weekend where Landry completely regressed, where it was severe separation anxiety. He was biting himself and chewing on his own arm, banging his head. He would pace in a circle around our living room for literally for 45 minutes to an hour. and you couldn't stop
Wow.
him. He would just walk in a circle. The only sounds that would come out of his mouth were just, incoherent, the D sound, D, D, D. And
I can't
at
imagine.
that point, we knew something was wrong. And I remember that
Sure.
weekend we rushed him to the doctor. The doctor said, I don't know, he was fine. And he said, well, he was worried about a brain tumor. So we took him and we got an MRI done, and that was normal. And at that point, all the answers just stopped. And they say, well, it looks like he's got autism and there's nothing you can do. We'll refer you to a neurologist, which they said they would do. They never did. And at that point, you're on your own. You are literally on your own. The state has services like ABA, things like that. But they base everything from a cognitive standpoint. Well, cognitively, my son was okay, and now he's not. And so my wife put in a Google search that said, if it's not autism, what is it? We always thought in our and I think a lot of people think this way, that you're just born with autism. And what I've learned since that day has been mind-blowing stuff. But her search came up with a doctor in Los Angeles, California named Michael Goldberg. And he said, these kids have immune issues. Their immune systems are essentially, they begin attacking themselves. And we contacted him, and, his waiting list was like 3-6 months out, something like that. It was crazy.
Wow.
We said, please put us on some sort of a cancellation list. On Christmas Eve, I got a phone call that said, we have an opening January 5th. And we said, book it. So we booked flights for us to fly out to Los Angeles to see this doctor. And in the meantime, he put us through a series of labs that we could do locally, just blood tests. And then when we got to California, we reviewed those tests. And Landry had NK cells that were extremely low. Now, they're natural killer cells. He had ANA titers, which are anti-nuclear antibodies, which show signs of autoimmune disorder, that he said were as high as you could basically go.
Wow.
And he asked us questions like, is he banging his head? And we said, yeah. And he said, is he doing it against the wall or against the sofa? And we said, well, he's been doing it on the sofa. And he said, well, he's got a headache. His head hurts. And he immediately, and there was other things too, obviously, that he looked at, but he immediately put us on a medication called Valtrex. It's an antiviral. They use it for herpes. Even though Landry did not test positive for HSV1 or HSV6, he said, I would like to try this. And upon putting him on that medication, in a week's time, Landry had lost his ability to eat with a spoon, okay? He would take his yogurt and use his hand to basically just hand feed himself with yogurt. You can imagine what that was like for a 2-year-old.
Wow.
And I watched him one morning. I put his yogurt in front of him, and he picked up his spoon, and he just started eating. He was outside, and a slide he hadn't played on for the whole summer, and this was in January. We had an unusually warm day in January here in Michigan, and he went up and down that slide. I don't know how many times, too many times to count. I have it on video. I was just blown away. I was like, okay, obviously something is going on here. Landry had also started, and I hear this one so much from parents, from parents who their kids are going through stuff like this. My kid won't sleep. He wakes up at 2:00 in the morning and he's wide awake. Well, that is candida. It's yeast overgrowth in the gut. The gut cannot control the candida. And essentially what happens is these children are drunk on their own yeast. And Landry would be up at 2 a.m. literally every night, jumping on his bed, laughing, giggling. And I would stay up with him until about, at the time I had no idea. I thought he was being naughty. Okay. I thought we had some
Right.
sort of a sleep
Right.
disorder. I would be up with him until 7 o'clock in the morning, and it's time for me to basically go to work. And he would pass back out. And you can imagine how our days would go from there and how exhausting that
Yeah.
is.
Wow.
Um, and every time I talk to a new parent, I'll ask them that question: is your child waking up at 2 or 3 a.m.? And they'll say yes. And I go, your child has candida, and you need to get them on an antifungal medication. You need to cut carbs and sugars out of your diet, out of their diet, um, and you need to get it under control. And we did that. We put him on an antifungal medication. He went through what's called a Herxheimer reaction, which is it's called die-off, really, where that candida gets in their bloodstream, and it's about 5 or 6 days of pure hell.
Wow.
And then on the opposite side of that is a child who starts sleeping all night, a child who is better rested, because that candida is under control. We changed his diet. We did food sensitivity panels, which aren't always accurate. We did heavy metal testing, and he did have high amounts of mercury, aluminum, things like that in his brain. And we just looked at the whole body, and I think most people don't realize, they think autism is a developmental disorder, but autism didn't exist before 1941. There's nothing in the annals, medical annals, going back as far as you can go, and they have been thoroughly searched and exhaustively searched. There is nothing like autism, what we know as this autism, before 1941, and a doctor by the name of Leo Kanner discovered it. Ironically, his second patient, child, had just had the smallpox vaccine.
Yeah, that's something that I had wondered about leading up to us talking, Joel, was there are certain conditions and disorders and diseases that were discovered in the 20th century, let's say, but you wonder, like, I mean, let's look at a commonly theorized biblical example of some of the situations that were encountered that are described in the Bible, that nowadays one would look at that and might be inclined to go, well, that sounds a lot like epilepsy, but they just didn't know what to call it back then. And there's got to be diseases like that we probably didn't know about or know what to call. Cancer probably existed before we knew as much as we do today, but they just didn't know what to call it. People would just, the mortality rate was not good for people over a certain age, and it just fell into that category. What you're saying is your research that you did suggested that there's nothing remotely like autism before that point in time. Am I understanding that right? Because that's very
That's
interesting.
there, right. That is correct. There was um, that social aspect of it. It did not exist. I mean, at least not in high. If it did, it was extremely rare. So to put that in
Sure.
perspective, the DSM codes for autism diagnosis, in the 70s are different than they are today. But if you actually look at those, and I hear this as an excuse all the time, if you actually compare those side by side, it's essentially the same thing. They're not that much different. It is an extreme social disorder, oftentimes that involves the
Hmm.
loss of ability to speak or communicate. Um, and in 1980, it was 1 in 10,000 children. And Phil, right now, as of today, the CDC puts it at 1 in 59 children. This is the largest epidemic that we have ever seen in human history, and it doesn't get discussed in that manner.
Hmm.
Um, and when I say autism, I mean, the people like Jerry Seinfeld who said, I might be on the spectrum. No, I'm talking about these kids have a severe disorder. These kids, um, I watch my son, and he desperately wants to play with other kids. And we were just in Virginia a couple weeks ago, and in the hotel pool, there were a couple of kids who were in his age group. and he desperately wanted to interact with them and play with them. And when it was time for them to leave, he got out of the pool with them and he just stood there and watched them. And his face was, well, as a dad, I have a hard time putting that into words. He wants friends. He wants to interact, but his body will not allow him to do it. We did some more in-depth testing. We've been to a lot of doctors. We've been from, Panama City, Panama, the Bahamas, New Jersey, Chicago, Wisconsin, LA, Michigan, Pennsylvania. We've been all over. I've seen my son, as his body tries to normalize and those autoimmune issues, as we try to stabilize his body, I see improvements with behavior. But we've been chasing that. We've been chasing our own tail, trying to get his body healthy in hopes that he would communicate again, right? But he has apraxia. His whole body is apraxic. His eyes are apraxic. He's orally apraxic. And his motor function, it's motor delay, okay? It's motor planning and motor delay. So his mind is cognitively, and I will say this for every child, I believe this wholeheartedly, every child with an autism diagnosis, they're there, they're all there. They're brilliant and they're all there. But because of that motor planning issue, their bodies can't do what their brain tells them to do. And we've done some more in-depth testing where we have actually found now autoantibodies against myelin, which is a major pathway in your brain. That would show why his speech dropped. We did find HSV1, which would show why the Valtrex worked. So, through the course of everything we've done, we've been getting answers, but ultimately, you want to be able to communicate with your child. You want to be able to hear "I love you," and you want to be able to tell it to them, and you want to believe they hear it and understand it, right?
Yes.
You will move heaven and earth for that to happen because you want the best possible life for your child. And that's what we've done. We've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars that we don't have doing this. And thank God we've recently stumbled upon something new that will give him that ability. I know his school, they try to work with him on an iPad. It's called the Core Board. And it's multiple screens, pictures with words. It's all these different things. But with that motor planning, eye apraxia, all those issues, he really struggles with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And his speech therapist actually came to our house to show us the Core Board. Like, we need to use this at home. And I watched her fumble through it, and I'm like, well, how the heck do you expect him to do that? With, she was trying to find the right page, and I was like, that's not going to cut it. So that's basically where we're at right now. Now we can go one of two ways with this. We can continue talking about what we did physically, or we can talk about what we've recently discovered and what's happened here in the last year for him. Because honestly, I think if there are parents out there who have kids who have this diagnosis, I think you need to find a doctor who will look at their whole body, and that will help their bodies regulate. If you feel better, I always compare it to when I have the flu and somebody expects me to perform my job effectively, they can pretty much kiss that thought goodbye. I don't feel good. I don't want to do it.
Right.
And that's a normal human response. When you're sick, you don't feel good, you can't perform well. Their bodies are sick, and their bodies a lot of times they're in pain, and things are happening they have no control over. And then we sit down and we expect them to, match colors and, perform all these tasks. And, it's not going to work. So you have to get their body into a state where they feel good, where their tummy doesn't hurt, where their head doesn't hurt. And that's so important, and it's so overlooked by mainstream medicine. They just think it's developmental. And we are not even going to take the time to look at what's wrong with their body. We're not going to look at immunology. And that's a shame, because so many kids are left behind and left in pain, and their behaviors reflect that. But they get aggressive when they get violent. Generally, it's frustration, but it's also pain. And honestly, it rips my heart out. It truly rips my heart out that our mainstream medicine has left these kids behind, because there's so many, and it continues to grow. The diagnosis continues to grow. I have a friend who we've done some treatments. It's because his gut health was so bad. We did FMT, which is only in clinical trials here in the U.S. You can only do it for C. diff here in the United States. A doctor I know, Dr. James Adams, he's out at Arizona State. He's running the clinical trials for kids with, gut dysbiosis, different diagnoses like that, for autism. And he's working diligently to try to get this approved for our kids here in the U.S., because what we've seen are 25% to 50% increases in behaviors, cognition, because of this treatment. In order for us to do it, I don't have time to wait on a clinical trial. Mm-hmm. In order for us to do it, we had to leave the country. And we saw it's a slow process. You take fecal bacteria from healthy donors, and basically you implant that into the microbiome of the child. Okay. It sounds gross, but it is what it is. It's been around thousands of years. The Chinese developed it originally. And you just try to create a whole new environment in the gut, because diversity is key, right? That creates health. And we were doing that with Landry. Well, a gentleman named J.B. Handley, he's an author. He's pretty well known in our circles. He created Generation Rescue with Jenny McCarthy. And his son is older than Landry. He's 18 now. He contacted me about this treatment for his own son. And so I said, hey, give it a shot, see what you could do. And through that, we've kind of remained in touch. And I've never met the man in person. He lives in Portland, Oregon. But well-connected guy, just a great guy, a hard worker, and that genuinely cares about his son. And he was the same thing as me. He ultimately wanted that communication for his non-speaking son, and was moving heaven and earth to get there.
Right.
Well, it was, our text relationship, I guess you'd call it, turned into a phone call in June of last year. And he just said, dude, you got a tissue. And I said, I'm smoking a pork butt. No, I don't. And he said, well, we'll get one. And we started talking. He said, Jameson is communicating with me. And I was like, what? What do you mean he's communicating with you? And he said, it's a new program called Spelling to Communicate, where it's only 6 years old. It's brand new. And the therapist who developed it has been in speech therapy working with our kids for the last 25 years. But she realized that these kids that she's working with are all cognitively above average, but everything that's holding them back, in their world, in school and whatever else, is all motor. It's all motor planning, all motor delay. There was some new science that has just come out from the University of Virginia that helped her make this discovery. And there's more on the way, by the way, peer-reviewed science. These kids, their eye tracking, from their brain to the eye to the hand, it's literally impossible for them to make their bodies do what they want them to do. And so what they do is they take that fine motor, and speech is as fine motor as you can get, and they put that into gross motor. So it's the way you sit, it's the way your shoulder moves, and they put a simple letterboard, alphabet, in front of these kids. And you start off by reading educational lessons of, a paragraph. There's keywords in that paragraph that you spell as you're reading the lesson. So, for instance, last night was, what was it? Scandinavia was one of the words that I spelled for Landry. And, and then at the end of that short lesson, we put the letterboard in front of him, tell him it's time to spell, give him, commands, and he will use his finger to point at the letters to spell the word. So we went to, I tried to do it at home because of the COVID shutdowns last year.
Right.
Bought the boards and the book, the first book, I was like all excited. I'm going to do this with Landry. Well, that didn't go very well. Landry was not having it. He was aggressive. He was violent, and he was angry we were doing this. I had no clue what I was doing. And I was complaining to JB about this. And he said, dude, you've got to go to Virginia. You've got to go to the therapy center. He said, I don't have any other advice for you. So finally, it was 2 weeks ago, we went to Growing Kids Therapy Center in Herndon, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. And we sat down with Elizabeth Vossler, who developed this. And she has a team of therapists there that all do this together. I watched her sit down with my son as I took a video, and she just talked to him like a person, like a normal person. I was largely ignored. And she said, Landry, I know you have trouble speaking using your mouth, and there's things in your brain, BRAIN, that are preventing you from doing that. What I'm going to do is teach you a new way to communicate using your hand. And then she picked up a letterboard and said, Landry, spell brain. And he just BRAIN. And I mean, my jaw dropped.
Wow.
Here's my son who I didn't know he could spell. I didn't know he could do any of this stuff. I had no idea.
Wow.
I didn't know. I knew he was in there. I know Landry knows what's going on, but I didn't know how smart he was. I didn't know if it really registered. And I watched this lesson progress to the point where she did a lesson on Bigfoot, the monster truck.
Right.
And, the guy who made Bigfoot was from Missouri, and she spells Missouri for him during the lesson. And then afterwards, I watch him MISSOURI. And I started crying. I mean,
Amazing.
tears coming down my face because my son, it was the pinnacle moment of our trip. And we were there for 3 days, and I watched it. And now it's not easy because you're developing a whole new pathway in the brain for for that apraxia to be overcome by developing that new pathway in the brain, and for them to be able to hit that letter they want.
Yeah.
Because I'll see him get totally frustrated because he wants P, but he's hitting Q, or the R. And there's cues. They train you as a parent. You don't touch their hands. You don't interact with them physically. You interact with them by coaching them and, trying to keep them on point and allowing that connection to take place in their brain to put it all together to hit that right letter. Sometimes it is boom, boom, boom. It's on point every time. Other times, it takes quite a bit. Now, Landry is 8 years old, and so he's squirrely. He doesn't have a lot of control over his body. I know guys, kids who have gone through puberty, they do better with this. They can sit through it easier. I tell you what, Landry, while we're reading the lesson, and all these kids are the same pretty much, he would be roaming around the room. He's not sitting there on your lap. He's walking around the room, looking out the window, dangling something in front of his face. It looks like he is the furthest thing from paying attention to what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I had to overcome that in my head because I thought Landry didn't like to read books because he wouldn't sit with us anymore like he used to when he was little.
Right.
And little did I know, he hears everything. And in fact, his sense of hearing and his sense of memory are overdeveloped because of his lack of ability to speak. And that doesn't make him savant. It just means that he hears everything, he listens well, and he remembers literally everything.
Wow.
And so I remember leaving Virginia. This was really cool because we just had these incredible moments down there in Virginia where I watched my son just break out of his shell, and I saw how proud he was, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and when we left Virginia, we drove back to Michigan, and we left there, and we got into Maryland. And I said, okay, let's try this. And I said, Landry, we just left Virginia. We just got into Maryland, and I spelled Maryland. Did the same thing for Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and then back into Michigan. And his grandfather, my dad, came over the next day, and he said, I would kind of like to see this. And so I took him into the other room and where it was quiet. And I said, Landry, what was the first state we came to when we left Virginia? And I held the board up, and he hit Maryland. And he did the same for, I said, what was the last state we got to where we live? And he spelled Michigan. And it's just for an 8-year-old kid. I mean, I have a 7-year-old daughter who's I consider pretty intelligent. And she saw this and she said, Daddy, nobody in my class could do what he's doing. So
oh man,
it's absolutely incredible to see this. Now, I think a lot of people on social media think that he's just openly communicating right now, and we're not there.
right.
This is a process, and it's a long process, especially for these little guys. It's quicker with the bigger kids. I know some guys who actually, one of them just wrote a book by himself. It took him 1.5 years, and he did it by pointing to letters and spelling, while his communication partner transcribed for him.
Wow.
And really good book, by the way. Gregory, Tino's his name, and if you can find it on Amazon, which you can, buy it today. it's amazing.
Yeah.
JB, who introduced us to this, JB has been doing the PR circuit. He's been doing interviews with, Jenny McCarthy, Robert Kennedy Jr., Del Bigtree on the High Wire. And he wrote a book called Underestimated about Jameson and their journey to this. The book is on Amazon. It's right now in autism category, at least it's far and away the #1 bestseller on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
And probably one of the top sellers overall, I believe. The book, he had Jameson write a chapter, and then 5 other young men who are spellers. They also wrote chapters in the book. The depths of the minds of these young men, the average person would drown in those depths. They are so graceful. They are so eloquent. Poetry naturally falls off their fingertips
right.
when they spell. It's absolutely stunning. It's beautiful, and I have yet to meet a person who hasn't cried reading that book, because everything we thought we knew is dead wrong.
Right.
It's dead wrong. We think these kids are not intelligent because they can't speak, and because their body is telling them to do something opposite of what they want to do. Gregory, Tino, and I just saw this post last night. Now I'll share this with you because I think it's a beautiful example. Gregory is 25 years old, okay? He had a longtime caretaker who just passed away, and that's devastating to a kid like Gregory, okay?
Sure.
And to his family. A huge part of his life. These kids don't have a lot of people who genuinely care about them,
Mm-hmm.
His mom, Linda, asked Gregory if he would like to go to the funeral, and he said no. He's scared to go. And she thought, well, he's scared of death, he's scared of dying. He's talked about this before. He's typed about this before.
Mm-hmm.
And come to find out that Gregory was scared to go to the funeral because he was afraid he would do something embarrassing like laugh instead of cry.
Right.
And he pointed that out to her. He can't control his body. And you talk about an eye-opener as a parent, because you walk a fine line as a ASD parent of, is that kid being a little jerk, or is that kid out of control and can't control what he's doing right now? It's so difficult. I can't put it into words how difficult that is. When to discipline, when to try to be more understanding, when to be patient, when to be kind, when to be, because it's, I've got 3 other kids, 1, 7, and 4. That's easy. I know when they're, I know
Yeah.
when it's time to do that. And they can tell me when they're hungry. They can tell me when their tummy hurts. They can tell me when they got a headache. They can do all those things. With Landry, I have no idea. I've had him go crazy before.
Right.
And you know what it was? He wanted an orange. How do you do that as a parent? It's such a difficult sea to navigate.
Sure.
And if I hear one more person tell me, well, God did this to you because he knew you could handle it, I mean, I want to knock somebody's head off when I hear that. Don't say that to people. If you're listening, don't say that to people.
Right. Right.
It's like one of the worst things you could say. Just if you're listening to this and you have a friend who's going through this, tell them you love them and tell them you care and try to be there for them whenever and however you can, because they have needs. If they can help you figure out what that need is, just try to meet it, because it is so difficult as a parent to go through this and to walk this road. And I will never go into all the details of what it's like publicly, because I have too much respect for my son. And I don't want to embarrass him, and it's not fair to him.
Right.
If he wants to talk about that, when we get to that point where Landry is openly communicating, he can talk about it.
Sure.
But until that day comes, I'll never get into all of the details. That's just,
Maybe that'll be in his book.
that's in his book, absolutely. And you know what? We've got to get to that point. Now I know my son is brilliant. I know that he can spell. And I asked the therapist while we were there, I said, okay, so I got to make sure I'm on the same page here. This kid can read. And she goes, how the heck could he spell if he can't read? It's like, touche. So he can read. He's listening. He knows. He's very, very intelligent. He's very smart, but he is not openly communicating. And we have to get that pathway created. And it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of frustration. I asked JB the other day, I said, or actually he called me and he was like, so what's your plan? And I said, we're going to grind at home. Which, another thing real quick, that was so cool, going through that aggression and everything. When I tried this at home with him before we ever went to Virginia, and I gave up. But then with the guidance of these therapists there in Virginia, to sit down with Landry and read to him and have him sit beside me and to have him start spelling those words with me and just our back and forth. It was the first time that my son and I were a team. Does that make sense? It was the first time that we had connected in that way.
Yeah.
And it was, excuse me, that was that's a moment, right? That's really cool. And he wasn't aggressive. He wasn't, I hate you, don't make me do this. And that's carried over now at home. Now it's not perfect. He's had some bad nights, but
Sure.
I told JB we're going to grind at home for a few months, and then I found a new practitioner in Chicago who I want to go see. And just you got to keep going back and just keep updating. And he said, dude, go to California. Dawn Marie Gabin is her name. And that's where JB's had been taken, Jameson, and he said she is the best of the best. And I said, well, yes, because why would I say no? He hasn't steered me wrong yet, right? So I just booked the trip for end of August, and we're going to be out there to go see Dawn Marie. And he said he's seen so many kids just become open after visiting with her for a couple of days. there's some incredible videos out there where you get to see these kids, these young men, talking to their mom or their dad for the first time.
Wow.
And telling them what's on their heart. And it's beautiful. And I told my wife, I said, if I could drop everything, if I had a way to feed my family for 6 months, I would do this in a second and
Absolutely.
become a therapist, because those kind of moments are what a way to make a living, right?
Yeah, no kidding. No kidding.
To see that. So I try to spread the word about, treating autism and looking at the whole body and looking at it from a medical perspective. But this is brand new to me, and this spelling to communicate is what we all want. If there's independent studies have it, 1 in 32 kids now with autism. And as I said earlier, the CDC says 1 in 59. If 40% of those kids are non-speaking,
yeah,
this changes everything. This changes futures for everyone. And just like being in Virginia for those 3 days, our whole future changed. Landry's whole future changed.
Yeah.
He can, once he develops in this, it's a regular school. It's college. There's the possibilities are endless, right?
Yes. Yes.
And many of these young men and women are saying that because of this, they feel like they can talk. Heck, Jameson feels like he can talk. He's going to start taking speech therapy again, because it's just created a whole new pathway in the brain that it's changed everything for them. So really cool stuff, eye-opening stuff. I know that the powers that be within the world of autism and the ABA community, they do not agree with this. They are adamantly against it. They feel like that it's fake. They feel like parents are manipulating their children to spell. All you have to do is watch a video. All you have to do is see it in person to know that these kids are in there and they're brilliant. And autism is not cognitive. It is definitely motor. They just can't control their bodies. And so that's where we're at right now. We're grinding at home. I'm watching my kid break out of a shell that he's been trapped inside for the last 5 years, right?
Right.
So it's really cool.
It's so great to, it's good to be able to give people in a tough situation a general sense of hope. And there's various ways they could derive that, right? They could just derive it from their own faith, from the support of friends and family, of just, just someday, maybe it'll get better. But to experience what you did so recently, where it's like, today's here, hope is happening,
Yeah.
it's there. It's something really significant is happening. That's so encouraging, and I hope I hope that
Yeah.
the word of this continues to get out, because I imagine that a situation that challenging tends to breed a sense of hopelessness.
It hope is tough.
Yeah.
And I would go into different treatments, different therapies, with ultimate hope. And it seemed like every time we would find something new that was magic for another family that we knew. I would go into that with just like, okay, this is going to happen. This is it for Landry, right? And then it didn't happen. Now we would see improvements. We would see good things from that, but ultimately, the cat in the hat was, or the rabbit in the hat that we were trying to get to pop out was communication, was speech.
Yes.
His little sister, Cora, she's 7, and I don't know for how many years now, every night at bedtime, she prayed for Landry.
Mm-hmm.
God, please help Landry feel better and talk again. That's how she starts every prayer. And in my mind, I think of that as, okay, when God willing, if he heals Landry, he's going to be talking, right?
Right.
There's going to be speech. And it hasn't happened. And then this happens. And,
right.
it's not what I expected. It came out of nowhere. But my goodness, if my son can communicate with me and has an avenue for that,
Right.
language is different than speech, right? We all have language. These kids have language.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They just can't present it in speech form. They have to do it, with a simple board with the alphabet on it, right?
Absolutely.
But either way, they're able to express their thoughts, their dreams, their hopes, their desires, their pains, their frustrations, all of that. And that's what we take for granted as people who can do that every day with no issue. So you can imagine how that feels to these people, these kids, and it really is beautiful. And I would encourage anybody who's listening to go on Amazon and get JB's book, Underestimated,
Yeah.
because it even if you don't know anybody who's going through this, read the book. It is an absolutely beautiful, beautiful book. And I had a friend of mine text me. She lives in Wisconsin, and she said, I've been married to my husband for 20 years, and I have never seen him cry. And last night and this morning, he's a blubbering mess. And that's not because it's sad. It's because it's so beautiful. Because if you can empathize with what these kids go through, if there's a banana and a pencil on the counter, they want the banana. You give them the pencil, right? And then they act out, and then they get in trouble for acting out. That's the comparison. I mean, can you imagine going through life that way? It, JB said that most of his son's behaviors where he was self-harming himself, he would hit himself so hard they had to go to the ER. And that's discussed in the book. And he said that's gone. It's absolutely gone since his son is openly communicating now. Those behaviors, those frustrations. And I think about my own son, and I know his behaviors, and how frustrated he gets, and what that looks like within our household. And I mean, I can't get there fast enough. I want to get to know him. I know Landry, but I don't really know him.
Right.
And so this is a beautiful therapy, a beautiful way to do that, which is going to open that door where, like I said, his hopes and dreams can finally come out. So we're excited. I had started giving up on hope. I had thought, okay, this is what life is going to be forever, and Landry's going to be with us forever, and we got to, figure out what that looks like. And he's only 8, right? So I'm always one where you plan for the worst and hope for the best, and hope was kind of diminishing. I had tried everything I knew to try, so um, all of that, and here the cheapest therapy we've ever done.
Yeah, there has to come a point, I would think, where you think we need to stay realistic here and start, adjusting our expectations, and those are natural coping behaviors that anyone would go through. So,
Yep.
what a blessing, what a gift to be given that flash of new hope, so to speak, as if to say, don't 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 scale back your expectations just yet.
Yeah.
There's new information. That's so fantastic. I'm really, really happy for you and your family.
Isn't it funny how God answers prayer not the way we see it, but the way we see it, though, or the way we think it's going to happen? Um, we have it in our own minds what it's going to look like, and God throws us a curveball, but ultimately
Mm-hmm.
He answers prayer, and He's doing it in a way that I think it's going to be more effective. Honestly, I do.
Yeah.
There could be this new treatment tomorrow that's going to help apraxia, but does that mean it's going to work for every kid that has apraxia? I don't know of any drug that ever has. I don't know of any treatment that ever has. Whereas this, is Elizabeth told me that this has a 100% success rate with
Wow.
the children that she's worked with and whose parents have stuck it out for the long haul. She's had parents quit. She's had, they just say it's too hard. We can't do it. And that's heartbreaking because it's heartbreaking to think about that child.
Sure.
I'll be honest. That tears me up. But she said it's if you stick it out and you put in the work, it's a 100% success rate. And I asked her this, and I know JB asked her this as well. Have you ever met a kid who cognitively they just could not do this? And she said, no, I have yet to meet one. So that really puts it in perspective. You've got some kids who are pretty severe, who are really in a bad place, and
Yeah.
and they can do this. They can absolutely do this. They can communicate by simply moving fine motor to gross motor and pointing at the alphabet.
Amazing.
Really cool.
Thanks for your time today, Joel, and thanks for sharing this. I'd like to plan on informally following up with you at some point, since there is such new developments here. Maybe in 6 months to a year or something, we chat again and see where things are at. I'm excited and very optimistic. I'm sure you're in even more so in that place than I am. So.
Oh, absolutely. We'll take it, one day at a time. That's all we can do. It's tough because
One day at a time. That's
you
right.
just okay. We got to go get that lesson done, and it would be so easy for me, especially with 3 other kids, and a small farm and work and all these different things to just we're not going to do it today. But I'm refusing to let that happen, and I'm refusing to let a word go unspelled.
Right.
If he's having a bad day, the lesson may get shortened, but you know what? If we're halfway through a word and he's refusing to cooperate, I don't care if it's 3 a.m. He's going to finish that daggum word. So, and that's the mindset that you have to have with something like this. So, we're going to persevere with this because it's for him, and it's for it's for his siblings, it's for us, but mostly it's all about him and breaking him out of that trap he's been in. And yeah, I do expect. I'm excited to see where we're at in 6 months. It's going to look completely different, and we're only a few weeks in, and it already looks different. So that keeps you going.